Hi, my name is Elias, and welcome to this session of Developing Your Authentic Voice. I am a professional singer, and I've been a teacher in universities and privately for voice for a number of years. I hope in these sessions to help anyone who listens to think about how they could use their own instrument in the way that they choose to. And I'm hoping that these tips or practices might help along that journey. So, I've talked about in a previous session musical instruments and how they produce sound and send their natural vibration out. The particular instruments that I used as examples, although you could use examples from any musical group, rock group, but I chose the orchestra because typically in a classical orchestra, the sections of instruments are defined by these groups: strings, percussion, woodwind, and brass. And each of these instrument groups, families if you would, produce sound in a very specific way. And I posed the question, how do we produce sound as speaking and singing instruments, and how could that relate to these other families of instruments? And the two that I think closely relates to the voice are the string section and the woodwinds. And here's why. The strings, typically in a stringed instrument, there are strings, obviously, and they are touched in some way to produce a natural vibration. So I say touched. In a cello or a bass fiddle or a violin, there's a bow that runs across the strings, and that causes sound to be produced. If we were going to use an instrument out of the orchestra, like a guitar, there's a pick or fingers. They make the sound go out into the universe. So how does that relate to voice, do I think? So these guys here that we can't see are called vocal cords or folds. And they vibrate, and that's how you get the sound. So the next section relates how the strings vibrate. So that would be woodwinds in my estimation. Because woodwind, you have wind, and it comes up and passes over our cords and vibrates, and that's how we get sound. Now, brass could be useful as well because you blow air through a pressurized mouthpiece, and that creates the vibration, goes into a bell and is amplified. But I did woodwind because it's got the word wind in it, and that relates to me to breath. So it's interesting to think about that as you're walking through your day, how that happens naturally without us thinking about it. That is how we produce sound. Air, pressurized, comes up and over the vocal folds. Interesting, right? I think it is. I've been talking about it for years, and I still am fascinated by it. So how does that happen, in short? Well, obviously when we're breathing, it's a process that's both conscious and not conscious, right? Because we don't walk around going, breathe, 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 right? It happens without us thinking about it frequently. Or we can put it into our conscious, deliberate thinking. So let's do that for a second. Let's take a breath. And think about what parts of our body react to that. Aside from speaking or saying, what happens? Why are we taking a breath? Well, we're filling up the lungs, you can see, and that causes my rib cage to expand. And other parts of my body react to that. Part that likes food expands a little bit. And if I was to turn sideways and feel back here, I notice that these muscles, the intercostal muscles, also expand. But in reality, or what's really happening, is that we're filling up our lungs, and all of these other parts that react work in tandem with that. So we fill up our lungs, and other things happen. The abs react, the diaphragm reacts. So the diaphragm is a muscle that we hear a lot about in speech and voice study. It's a sort of gelatinous guy that sort of hangs out below the rib cage, and what it does is it reacts to the pressure change inside. And when the air fills up the lungs, the diaphragm sort of descends as we inhale. When we exhale, it goes back up to its position where it was hanging out before. So that's why I said the word pressurized air when I referred to woodwinds. They use reeds and they push through the reeds, and that creates sound. That's what we do as well. I find that it's super important to isolate that practice, to think about breath and isolate it in a singular way. The last example I'm going to give is, think for example, if you've ever talked to a dancer or you've taken a course in dance, say ballet for example. One of the activities that you would see along a bar with mirrors is the dancer would bend. The French word for it is plier. It's just bending, right? So a dancer practices that to isolate that particular movement. Breath, for me, it would be useful to have exercises, and is useful, to isolate this process that we were speaking of. And further study helps individualize those sessions, because every body is different, and different exercises work with different people, both how they understand them and how it might affect their body. So I'm going to ask you to think about when you're walking around, take a second and take this breath process that you're not thinking about, and think about it for a second, and just notice how your body, your specific body, produces sound through air. And I'm going to leave you with this. We talked a bit about the diaphragm muscle reacting. Like when we inhale, it descends because of the pressure, and when we exhale, it goes back up. What I'd like you to think about is that you're walking around in your day, the difference between the rate that the diaphragm returns back up after it descends when you take a breath, the difference between when that happens when you're just breathing naturally and walking around, and when you speak or sing. How does that rate change? Is it faster or slower when we sing versus when we're not singing or speaking? It's an interesting thing to consider. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we have another session. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to doing more of these. And if any of this material is engaging to you, feel free to join the Rainbow channel and to listen to other videos that are in the Developing Your Authentic Voice playlist. Thank you.